Well, thank you so much for inviting me to this conference. It's really a pleasure to be back, and I'm also very grateful for all of you who've made it this morning, given that this week does not only consist of conferencing, but also of football and celebrations. I was invited to give this talk here today, and contrary to convention, I would say, I'm not going to present you a theory or a series of findings, but more of a research agenda that I think that young scholars, postdocs, people still in shaping their careers could, in the foreseeable future, focus on. And I'm doing that for a reason. On the one hand, I, as a populism scholar, work in what is the most crowded field in a way. Populism is one of the hottest topics in political science in many ways, and one of my colleagues, Kai Artsheimer at the University of Mainz, who collects all publications on especially radical right-wing populism, has counted over 500 ISI-ranked articles and peer-reviewed books that have been published on the topic in Western Europe alone since 2005. So there's no shortage of scholarship on populism. But the kinds of questions that have been asked and the kinds of approaches that have been taken have been very much focused on a limited number of topics that are very central within party politics, namely, why do these parties emerge? Why they're successful? Why do they attract a lot of support from voters? And in a second step, once they're there, what is their impact on national policy making? And then especially on, for example, immigration policy, because that's at the core of their programs. But I think that we see certain developments that warrant all kinds of other questions now that this phenomenon has been about for a while. And I want to point those questions out to you today. So, as you might know, over the past year, there has been a renewed interest in what I refer to as radical right-wing populist parties. We had Brexit, we had the election of Donald Trump, and then the radical right-wing populist parties themselves declared a Patriotic Spring in which they would conquer elections in first the Netherlands, then France, and subsequently also Germany and other countries in which there might be elections. And this was a frame that was very happily embraced by the media, who covered a global trend of rising populism, sometimes referred to as the new populism, other times as the new nationalism, sort of reinforcing this idea, one, that this was a new phenomenon, and two, that this was reaching peak height at this moment. Now, of course, as soon as the election results from the Netherlands were in, this frame sort of started to dwindle a bit, because Geert Wilders didn't do as well as expected. And in the subsequent elections in France, Marine Le Pen also didn't get the success that the media had predicted, at least. Now, of course, this frame, first of a patriotic spring and then of a defeat of populism, doesn't sit very well with what we already know from scholarly research, because we tend to look at broader patterns and not at incidental elections. And when we do that, we see that, yes, indeed, radical right-wing populist parties are the most successful party family to emerge since the Second World War. They are, by all standards, in terms of electoral support, etc., more successful, for example, than green parties, which have also emerged, than social populist parties, radical left parties, more successful also than new regionalist parties. And we do see in recent years an increase both in the number of parties. So we see that more radical right-wing populist parties are represented in various countries. When we look back at the 1990s, for example, there were still a number of countries that didn't have a radical right-wing populist parties. By now, almost the entire map of Europe is colored in. We also see a proliferation of radical right-wing populist parties within countries. So while previously there was usually one successful radical right-wing populist parties contending, we now see that various countries actually have multiple and that they together compete for an electoral constituency. Think of the Netherlands, for example, where we do not only have Geert Wilders' PVV represented in parliament, but now also Thierry Baudet's Forum for Democracy. Think of Austria, where we've had both the BZÖ and the FPÖ competing, and this is increasingly the case in other countries as well, that we see a proliferation of radical right parties that try to tap into slightly different electoral constituencies, for example, in terms of educational level. And yes, we do see an increase in both vote and seat share over time. But that is not something new, and that is not something that happened in the aftermath of Brexit and Trump. That is a long-term trend that has started in the 1980s, and that with smaller setbacks over time has continually increased in most countries. What we also have seen, and this is also not a new phenomenon, is the government participation of these parties in coalitions in Western Europe. We've seen this in Austria, we've seen it in Italy and other countries. So we see a long-term trend of success for these parties, irrespective of the current so-called Patriotic Spring. And I think this is very clear if we look at the election results in various West European countries in the past years. Yes, radical right-wing populist parties are getting bigger and bigger. Most notably, think of Switzerland, where the SVP almost has a third of the votes, but also the case, for example, in Denmark, where the Danish People's Party polls over 20%. But in many countries, the success is less pronounced, and these parties poll between 10 and 15, or even less than 10%. So there's a lot of variation also in support, irrespective of the frame that has emerged. And this is the overview of the radical right-wing populist parties that have governed. And if we look at that, we actually see that the heavy point of the government participation was actually in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, with parties assuming office in 2001, 2002, 2003. That more recently, this has only been the case in Finland, Norway, and in a way Switzerland, but their governments are formed very differently. There's a form of collective government. So the peak in government participation was actually prior to this period. Now, of course, although we know a lot about the success of these parties and why people vote for them, who votes for them, on average more lower educated voters than higher educated voters, more males than females, either younger or older voters, but not the generations in between. And we know that their primary motivation is identitarian in nature, related to immigration, in combination with dissatisfaction with politics. I think there are, in the current context, at least two pressing questions that we don't have an answer to yet. The first is what the actual effect of Brexit and Trump has been. So in the media, there has been a frame that it was beneficial in many ways, that this was the launch of the Patriotic Spring. But I think we should increasingly question ourselves whether it might not have been a negative effect, especially of Trump, because many voters for radical right-wing populist parties have always declared that they do not necessarily want their party to govern, but that they want the influence of these parties on mainstream politics. So one of the goals of these voters has been strategic, to pull mainstream parties more to the right, so to speak, especially on social cultural issues. And I think one of the things that Trump might have done is shown that when these parties come into office, they actually do what they say to a large extent. And that does not necessarily sit well with the objective that these voters might have had. So there might also have been a negative effect instead of a positive effect. And the second thing I think we need to examine is what the effect of the refugee crisis has been. We've seen that most radical right-wing populist parties have really peaked in the polls at the time of the height of the refugee crisis, with support rising to over 30% of the population in many West European countries, but that this effect has quickly subsided once the number of refugees declined. And we don't really know what happened here, whether that is an immediate effect of the number of refugees coming in and being perceived as a problem, whether that is an effect of media coverage of the refugee crisis, and whether this means that other considerations of competence come into play once the elections are there, and whether supporting radical right-wing populist parties in the poll is merely a form of expressing discontent with the establishment that is then not followed up on in the elections themselves. And I think it's very interesting there to compare also the effect of the refugee crisis with that of the financial crisis. Because in the literature on populism, it is always claimed that a crisis is a precondition for success for populist parties. And that can be a political crisis in terms of a failure of representation, which is, of course, one of the things on which populist parties have capitalized, campaigning against the establishments which fail to represent citizens, especially on immigration issues and on European integration. But it, of course, can also be a crisis of socio-economic or socio-cultural nature. And Hans-Peter Krisi and Takis Papas, a couple of years ago, have investigated what the effect of the financial crisis was on populist parties, and they found that it greatly differed across European countries depending on the interaction between the actual financial crisis and the perceived political crisis in the country in which the populist parties were operating. And my hypothesis would be that the same would be the case for the refugee crisis, that it is an interaction between the problems experienced by the refugee crisis in the European countries and the failures of mainstream politics to address these problems. And I think that the interaction between the two is where we can find some of the answers to this question. But that's with respect to the success of radical right-wing populist parties themselves, because I don't think that explaining the success is the most interesting thing at the moment. Because what is truly new about this period of Brexit and Trump? I think it is, and I initially termed it when I handed in my title, the globalization of national populism, but I think that the correct term is actually the transnationalisation of radical right-wing populism. I think what we are witnessing for the first time now is that radical right-wing populism is not only becoming a global phenomenon, proliferating through the world to different continents, not only to the United States, but also, for example, to India and the Philippines, but that it's becoming truly transnational in nature in the way in which, first of all, the ideology is taking shape, and secondly of all, the parties themselves are organizing. And I think, importantly, this is not only the case for the radical right-wing populist parties themselves, with which we are all, as citizens, very familiar. So this is not only the case of the Front National, or the FPÖ in Austria, or Geert Wilders' PVV in the Netherlands, but also of radical right-wing populist social movements, who are increasingly playing a role in politics. And one of the ways in which we've seen this is, for example, in the context of the refugee crisis, where a lot of the local protests and opposition to refugee centers has not been organized by radical right-wing populist parties in their institutionalized form, but by very much bottom-up social movements of a radical right-wing populist nature, who have acted as organizing forces for what at first sight seemed to be disgruntled citizens, but actually had a lot more organization behind it than we thought. And I think we also see an increasing interaction between the parties on the one hand and the movements on the other hand. And I'll show you some examples of that. And the reason I want to point this out is that scholarly, these two fields have always been very separated. So radical right-wing populist parties have been studied by party politics scholars working on elections and party systems, whereas social movements have been studied by social movement scholars using social movement theory. And I think one of the things we need at the moment to understand this global phenomenon is an integration of the two and a meeting of the two kinds of theories to see how this phenomenon is actually expanding at the moment. So in that respect, this is also a call for action for both party politics scholars and social movement scholars to get together and to really jointly study this phenomenon. Now, what do I mean when I talk about the transnationalization of radical right-wing populism? First of all, I mean it in an ideological sense, in the way in which the ideology of what are essentially nationalist parties are taking shape. And the most important defining characteristic of radical right-wing populist parties for Kasmada, who is the most prominent scholar in this field, is nativism. So a combination of nationalism and xenophobia, which makes for a very exclusionary ideology in which all kinds of non-native elements, whether that is immigrants, whether that is ethnic minorities in the country itself, whether that is social parasites, are excluded because they are a threat to the nation state. Now, of course, this ideology is full of empty signifiers, of concepts that need to be defined by the radical right-wing populist parties themselves to have meaning. And historically, this meaning has always been provided in a national context. So initially, this ideology was about the true French having to come first, or the true Dutch having to come first, and having to be defended against minorities within the country itself. But on the basis of ideological notions, this nation state and this nation have been increasingly defined in international terms. And this is not just a strategic ploy of radical right-wing populist parties. This is actually a shift that is rooted in ideological development. So many radical right-wing populist parties these days adhere to the idea of Eurabia, the notion that Europe is actively being conquered by Islam to subject Europeans to Islamic rule. And this is a notion that these parties borrow from Patriotic and other theorists who see this as an active strategy on the part of the Islamic world. Geert Wilders has been very important in taking up these ideological notions and translating them into a political program, but we see that other radical right-wing populist parties are taking them up as well. So here it is seen as a challenge to a European people rather than specifically to the Dutch, the French, or the Austrians. Very much focused on Islam. What we increasingly see, and this from a democratic point of view is very worrying, that this theory is actually broadened to the notion that the entire white race is under threat from immigration. And also this is rooted in ideology and existing theories, of course conspiracy theories, but theories nevertheless, such as the Kalergi plan and the idea of an orchestrated white genocide in which mainstream parties are complicit. So there are streams within the radical right, especially in the social movements, who believe that this is an active development to destroy the white race. And this idea is becoming increasingly influential. So there again, also the nation, the we, is widened to include the entire white race, and the opposition is to any form of immigration from non-Western countries. In this ideological framework, we see a reinterpretation of national identity by these radical right-wing populist parties. Because if there's a shared enemy that is global in nature, in the form of Islam, or in the form of non-white people, then the in-group becomes defined in those same global terms as well. So it's about those having Judean Christian values or those being white. And we see therefore an increased emphasis on what we as a European people share with each other. For example, in terms of history, so we see more references to Greek and Roman history and what that means for us being European, to the Enlightenment, to the French Revolution as defining who we as a European people are. And I think the easiest way to illustrate that is through a short video that one of the social movements that is very prominent in the field made at the moment. It's called Génération Identitaire. It's a movement that was originally founded in France and that has now spread to most West European countries. And there they summarize their ideas as follows.
Nous sommes la génération identitaire.
Nous sommes la génération de ceux qui meurent pour un regard de travers, une cigarette refusée ou un style qui dérange.
Nous sommes la génération de la fracture ethnique, de la faillite totale du vivre ensemble, du métissage imposé.
Nous sommes la génération de la double peine, condamnée à renflouer un système social trop généreux avec les autres pour continuer à l'être avec les nôtres.
Nous sommes la génération victime de celle de mai 68, de celle qui prétendait vouloir nous émanciper du poids des traditions, du savoir, de l'autorité à l'école, mais qui s'est d'abord émancipée de ses propres responsabilités.
Nous avons fermé vos livres d'histoire pour retrouver notre mémoire.
Nous avons cessé de croire que Kader pouvait être notre frère, la planète, notre village et l'humanité, notre famille.
Nous avons découvert que nous avions des racines, des ancêtres et donc un avenir.
Notre seul héritage, c'est notre terre, notre sang, notre identité. Nous sommes les héritiers de notre destin. Nous avons éteint la télévision pour descendre à nouveau dans la rue.
Nous avons peint nos slogans sur les murs, scandé la jeunesse au pouvoir dans nos mégaphones, brandi bien haut nos drapeaux frappés du lambda.
Ce lambda, qui ornait le bouclier des glorieux Spartiates, est notre symbole.
Vous ne comprenez pas ce qu'il représente? Il signifie que nous ne reculerons pas, que nous ne renoncerons pas.
Nous sommes lassés de toute vos lâchetés. Nous ne refuserons aucune bataille, aucun défi.
Vous êtes les 30 glorieuses, les retraites par répartition, SOS racisme, la diversité, le regroupement familial, la liberté sexuelle et les sacs de riz de Bernard.
Nous sommes 25% de chômage, la dette sociale, l'explosion de la société multiculturelle, le racisme anti-blanc, les familles éclatées et un jeune soldat français qui meurt en Afghanistan.
Vous ne nous aurez pas avec un regard condescendant, des emplois jeunes, une tape sur l'épaule. Pour nous, la vie est un combat.
Nous n'avons pas besoin de votre politique de la jeunesse. La jeunesse est notre politique.
Ne vous méprenez pas, ceci n'est pas un simple manifeste, c'est une déclaration de guerre.
Nous sommes demain, vous êtes hier.
Nous sommes la génération identitaire.
So I think what's interesting about this video is that it shows the mixing of both biological racist arguments, so referring to the mixing of races, as well as cultural arguments that fit more with an identitarian approach, and that it explicitly refers to European history as a rallying point. So the Labda, taken from the Spartans, is seen as a sign of defense against foreign enemies that we faced before. And similar references are, for example, made to the Crusades as a point where the Europeans rallied against the Islam and other historical moments. Now, of course, the transnationalization of the ideology is not perfect. National context remains important in shaping the ideas of these parties, and we do see differences based on national context in the ideology. So, for example, in the Netherlands, the ideology of these parties is, in a way, explicitly liberal, mostly emphasizing the threat that migrants form for tolerance, gay rights, equality of men and women. In France, it's very much rooted within republicanism, so defending the laïcité of the French state, whereas in Scandinavia, for example, Scandinavian feminism is also included and taken into a nationalist ideology. Now, I think that transnationalization of the ideology has important implications for the way that in which these parties operate, and thus affect politics at the national level, but also at the EU and the global level. And I want to say a little bit about that, because I think there's many questions here that we need to address that we know very little about at the moment. First, what we observe is a diffusion of campaign tactics among radical right-wing populist parties. In terms of the kinds of messages that are sent out in campaigns, Geert Wilders campaigned on "We will make the Netherlands great again." This is not something he came up with himself, but something he actively borrowed from Trump, but also really in terms of tactics. So one of the things that Geert Wilders did in his campaign in March was a refusal to cooperate with the mainstream media and engage in debates with other politicians. Now, this was something he had also taken from the American context, and which is currently also being tried by Theresa May, of course, because this is something that's not limited to radical right-wing populist parties. We also see this, for example, in the use of the same campaign companies by radical right-wing populist parties, such as Cambridge Analytica, which was also active in the Brexit referendum. We also see it in the way in which discourse and substantive positions are diffusing among radical right-wing populist parties, with one after another starting to campaign on Brexit, Frexit, or Nexit. This was not something that they had done before. This was a change of stances in the past year. But also, for example, the diffusion of welfare chauvinism as a policy package that was taken from Denmark and then presented in other countries. We also see it in the way in which international social media campaigns impact on national elections. So we see that radical right-wing populist parties actively use social media resources from an international context in national elections, engage, for example, as you can see here below, Twitter bots to campaign for them, and there's increasing evidence now that those Twitter bots that campaigned for Trump and that campaigned in the Brexit referendum are the same Twitter bots that also campaigned in the Dutch election campaign for Wilders and for Marine Le Pen in the French election campaign. We see an increase in international financing of campaigns. So Marine Le Pen, for example, borrowed a great deal of money from a Russian bank, but Geert Wilders has been sponsored over the past years by the Horowitz Institute in the United States for their campaigns. We see an increasing impact of international events on national campaigns. The Dutch elections were, to some extent, decided by a row with Turkey at the very last moment, in which, of course, radical right-wing populist parties also play an active role in politicizing the event. And we might or might not see an impact of the increasing terrorist threat in Europe. A bit of a similar story goes for the radical right-wing populist social movements. We see a spread of social movements across countries. So, for example, if we take the Soldiers of Odin, who are now active in almost all West European countries, they originated from the Scandinavian countries. This is where they already existed. But once they started focusing on refugees and migration and acting as sort of neighborhood watches in many cities in the Scandinavian countries, they were actually copied as a model in other West European countries and founded there to perform the same functions. The same goes for Pegida, which of course originated in Germany and was very successful there, but where we saw a proliferation of Pegida movements in other West European countries being set up with the help of the Germans. This picture was taken, for example, in Flanders, where Pegida Flanders was manifesting, and where the people in the front of the picture holding the banner are actually Dutch who had moved from the Netherlands to support the Flemish demonstration. And as well, this goes for the identitarian movement of which Génération Identitaire is a part. What we also see here is a diffusion of action repertoires. Historically, classic extreme right movements have been known for very traditional, conventional ways of protesting, organizing demonstrations, getting together in smaller groups. But we actually see that these kinds of movements are increasingly adopting tactics that are also, or traditionally used more by what we would loosely label left-wing social movements in the environmental policy domain, for example, or organizing around inequality. To give one example, Casa Pound, we're in Italy here. Casa Pound is of course known for its social activities, for squatting empty houses, for organizing social gatherings in these houses, acting in many ways in the same way as the communists used to do with their people's houses in the past. Now, recently in France, this tactic was also adopted by the GUD, who has started to squat houses in Lyon in France to perform the same kinds of functions. So we see a diffusion of tactics there. Now, what I think the questions is that we need to ask ourselves as social scientists is, first of all, under what circumstances does this occur? Because not all the radical right-wing populist parties and social movements do it to the same extent and at the same time. And more importantly, when does it have an effect? So it can be that you adopt all kinds of practices from abroad, but it might not work in all contexts. So for example, in the Netherlands, Geert Wilders' decision to not participate in public debates really backfired. Because in a consensus culture in which the exchange of opinions is deemed important, this was seen by citizens of all political leanings as unacceptable. So something that might work in the context of American two-party system and weak political parties might not work in a European system of multi-party politics. And I think Theresa May might be facing the same kind of backlash at the moment. And the same goes for all these social media tactics and all kinds of other. When does it have an effect? And I deliberately used the term diffusion here because I think we can learn a lot from diffusion theory about how these processes take place. Because it might be very similar in terms of learning as policy diffusion or diffusion of democracy. Now, I also think, and I put these issues in for some of the political theorists here in the room, I also think these kinds of developments raise very important issues for normative theory. There's massive issues here about sovereignty and how you can organize national elections in a way that there's no significant interference from outside. And of course, France incidents with Macron being hacked is a prime example of this. And it raises, I think, a lot of questions about the concept of militant democracy. How can democracy protect itself against threat and organize itself in such a way that it is safeguarded? One of the things, for example, is party financing. And contrary to the US, many West European countries do not have legislation that forbids outside financing for election campaigns. And it might be the case that we need to think about what democracy is allowed to do to protect itself from being affected. Now, we also see the impact of this transnationalization tendency at the EU level, where historically radical right-wing populist parties have been unable to organize for a whole range of reasons, for their ideological differences, but also for the fact that their historical leaders, Jean-Marie Le Pen, Jörg Haider, etc., were unable to cooperate. But we've seen with the 2014 elections that for the first time these parties have organized in a successful party group that has gone on to meet the criteria of party group formation in the European Parliament. And this, of course, increases the opportunities that these parties have because they have more financing. But it has also increased their participation in the legislative process. Previously, radical right-wing populist parties abstained in over 40% of all legislation being discussed in the European Parliament. They've now actually actively engaged since 2014 in the legislative process. And we see increasing cooperation. So prior to 2014, and this is a research project we did recently, we saw that the coherence in voting behavior between radical right-wing populist parties was very low. All party groups in the European Parliament have a party line that's followed, which enables them to influence policy making. And these party groups vote together in over 90% of all legislation that's tabled. For radical right-wing populist parties, this was always below 60%. There was very little cooperation. But since 2014, we see that they have developed this idea of a party line that is followed, that they vote the same on proposals, and if they disagree, that they tactically abstain. So, for example, the Dutch PVV is quite liberal with regards to personal rights compared to the other parties, which are far more conservative. But when issues of homosexuality have been debated in the European Parliament, it's decided to abstain, not to affront the colleagues in the group. So we see very deliberate cooperation there, which of course increases the influence of radical right-wing populist parties in the legislative process in the European Parliament, which was prior to this very limited. Of course, their behavior is not completely unified yet in the European Parliament. In that respect, it's very different from the other groups which are more or less coherent. There are a number of radical right-wing populist parties that do not wish to cooperate with the others because of national considerations. And in that way, radical right-wing populist parties are more engaged in a multi-level game at the European politics than other parties. Because not only do they have ideological considerations to keep in mind, they're also very much aware of what the consequences of European cooperation might be at the national level. And a recent study by Duncan McDonnell and Anneke Werner has found that these parties actually try to attach themselves to mainstream parties when they feel that this could help their coalition ability at the national level. So some of the Scandinavian parties, such as the Danish People's Party, have decided to ally with the UK Conservatives, trying to signal that if other conservatives in Europe are willing to cooperate with them, national conservatives should do the same. So we see that this national dimension does remain more important for radical right-wing populist parties than for other parties. We see the same at the level of the social movements. So we see a transnational social movement emerging with all these national social movements cooperating with what I already said, a new action repertoire, mainly borrowed from the left, and increasing interactions between parties and social movements. And again, I would like to point out an initiative taken here by the identitarian movement, because it really shows the transnational dimension of these social movements. What they did recently is they started a crowdfunding action as a European identitarian movement to crowdfund a boat that would counter NGO boats in the Mediterranean that were trying to save refugees. They set a goal of 50,000 euros to crowdsource, which they got within a week. And they've used this money to campaign there. And I think that the video that goes with it speak volumes of where's the video? It speaks volumes of the transnationalization, but also the change in taxation.
Every week, every day, every hour, ships packed with illegal immigrants are flooding the European border. An invasion is taking place.
This massive immigration is changing the face of our continent. We're losing our safety, our way of life, and we will become a minority in our own country. Our future is under attack.
It all starts right here, at the European borders.
Right here, the illegals make the first step on European ground. Right here, the NGOs and human traffickers are endangering the future of our people. Right here, our governments are betraying and failing us by letting this happen.
From all across Europe, we gather here in Sicily to take action. Our mission is clear and simple: to defend Europe.
We want to expose the so-called humanitarian NGOs. They cooperate with human traffickers who live from people's misery. We want to protect our borders and face those criminals on the sea.
This is just the beginning. We are preparing a big rescue mission on the Mediterranean Sea.
It's a mission to rescue Europe by stopping illegal immigration. We want to get our crew, equip a boat and set sails to the Mediterranean to chase down these enemies of Europe. To start our mission, we need your help. The immigration lobby is funded with hundreds of thousands of euros by the government and by big donors. We, on the other hand, depend only on you to fund this mission and to defend Europe.
Where the governments fail, we step in, because this land is ours. It starts here and it has to end here.
Tutto parte da qui e dovrà essere fermato qui.
Ça commence ici et ça doit finir ici.
Hier fängt es an und hier muss es enden.
So this transnational cooperation between social movements is something that's really unprecedented. And also the tactic, which is almost Greenpeace-like, using boats to interfere with the behavior of NGOs, is something that is taken from a completely different side of the political spectrum to inform the actions of this specific social movement. I think that the questions here are mainly what is the long-term effects of these kinds of cooperation that emerge? Does it make these organizations more attractive? Does it increase their success? Does it increase their influence? And secondly, what are the implications more broadly than for the EU integration project? If there's agents working from inside to inhibit the European integration process. And this is not only the case in the European Parliament, but it also affects, for example, European treaties, European Court of Justice, etc. Now, the last thing I want to address, also because I was invited by someone who is into geopolitics, is the way in which this transnationalization affects global political developments. And I think prior to these developments, we've never really thought of radical right-wing populist parties as actors in international relations. They just didn't factor in to our analyses. But they're increasingly manifesting themselves as actors that are engaging in diplomacy and engaging in international negotiations. And they do this on the basis of the principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So whoever is against migration, whoever supports the notion of national sovereignty, and whoever is against European integration can be used as an ally. And this leads to something which is very interesting, I think, from an international relations perspective, which is a double orientation towards both Russia and US at the same time. So these parties ally with both rather than just one of the global forces, because both fit into their idea of national isolationism and national sovereignty, and both are also at the moment a threat to the European integration process and therefore an ally. One noticeable thing, I think, which is really new as a result of this transnationalization of their ideology, is that they see Israel as an ally because it's seen as the outpost of the Western world in the Middle East. So from this idea of Eurabia, Israel becomes a really important agent and ally for radical right-wing populist parties, which is something that we've previously, when some of these parties were still anti-Semitic, etc., have never seen. And these parties do actively engage in this whole international process, as we can see from the past years. And on the principle of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, we've seen, for example, radical right-wing populist parties ally with Assad as someone who can be used in the struggle against ISIS. This is Philippe de Winter of the Vlaams Belang visiting Assad last year. We've also seen radical right-wing populist politicians tour the Middle East. Marine Le Pen has been to Lebanon recently, and when she was there, she also said that she felt that Assad was an ally in the struggle against Islam. We've seen radical right-wing populist parties ally with Russian representatives, for example, at the FPO conference last year. We've seen them ally with Trump, and we've seen them ally more broadly with the Republican Party. This is Geert Wilders, who was invited by Steve King, a Republican senator, to Capitol Hill to give a speech there. And I think this is something very new that we've not seen before, because they've never been taken seriously in an international context as potential partners. And I think this raises a lot of issues about how this factors into international power relations, how this also affects international organizations, etc. So the message I wanted to convey today is, first of all, that this transnationalization of nationalism has important implications for politics at all levels, primarily the national level, but also the EU and the global level. I think it calls for attention for radical right parties and movement and the interactions between the two, because we've seen that these crossovers, which were historically not accepted when the social movements were still of an extreme right neo-Nazi character, are now taking place because the social movements themselves have changed. I think it also calls for attention to both empirical and normative questions and the relation between the two. I think it calls for more interdisciplinary research where we cooperate as communications, science scholars, sociologists, political scientists, working from different kinds of theoretical perspective, and that we need to borrow, and this has always been an issue in the field of radical right-wing populism, to borrow from existing theories and not see these parties as unique and meriting their own theories. So I think we can use diffusion theory, social movement theories, and all kinds of other theories to explain what's going on, and at the same time doing justice to the uniqueness of this phenomenon as a new political ideology. Thank you.